Setting in a regular sleeve. Before setting in the sleeve, the bodice should be checked for the correct sleeve placement. If necessary, adjust the placement of the arm's eye seam on the garment so that the sleeve will fall smoothly from the end of the shoulder. The sleeve cap seam line is larger than the armhole of the garment, so the extra fullness in the sleeve must be eased into the armhole of the garment. To help ease in the extra fullness, place a row of ease stitching on the sleeve cap seam line between the notches. Use a slightly lengthened stitch of about 10 stitches per inch. A longer stitch will cause the ease to pucker. Then stitch the underarm seam and press the seam open. Draw up the easing thread from the wrong side of the sleeve. Most of the ease is located within about 2 inches on each side of the top of the sleeve cap. Remove any excess fullness. The sleeve cap should cup over the end of your hand, but there should be no apparent excess fullness along the seam line. With right sides together, pin the sleeve to the bodice matching underarm seams, the top of the sleeve cap to the shoulder seam, and the notches. You will usually find the double notch to be the back of the sleeve and the single notch to be in front. Notice that the sleeve is always facing up and that the pins are placed on the sleeve side. If it is necessary to check the fit of the sleeve before stitching, place the pins parallel to and directly on the seam line. When pinning the top of the sleeve, place your hands underneath the garment and roll the sleeve to the top. When drawing up the easing thread, you want the sleeve to actually be a little larger than the garment armhole circumference. Work that extra fullness in as you are pinning the sleeve. Stitch the sleeve to the garment starting at one of the notches. Stitch the underarm section first, then continue around the top of the sleeve cap to the starting point. Notice that the sleeve is on top as you do the machine stitching. To strengthen the seam, continue the stitching to make a second row of stitching between the notches. This underarm section of a set-in sleeve is usually trimmed to 3/8 inch to allow more room for movement. The armhole seam allowance is never clipped. These raw edges may need to be finished and can be zigzagged together. A set-in sleeve should have a smooth, rounded cap with no pleats or gathers along the seam line, unless these are a part of the design of the garment. Making a continuous lapped placket. The continuous lapped placket is a slashed opening, finished with a single strip of fabric, creating a narrow lap. The markings for the stitching lines for the slashed opening are usually drawn 1/4 inch away from the slash line. Bring these lines to a slightly rounded point at the end of the placket opening. Reinforce the seam line by stitching along the marked line. Use a shorter stitch length of about 15 to 20 stitches per inch to help reinforce the end of the placket opening. Stitch up to the point of the placket, then take one stitch across the point before continuing down the other side of the placket. Cut along the slash line too, but not through the reinforced stitching at the point. Failure to slash to the point will cause the fabric to pucker and may prevent the placket from lying flat and smooth. The strip to be used to bind this opening can be cut either on the bias or on straight grain. The straight grain strip may be a little easier to manipulate as it has less give than the one cut on the bias. The strip is cut twice the length of the slashed opening and about 1 1/4 inches wide, which will make a finished width to the binding of 3/8 inch. With right sides together, pin the fabric strip to the slashed opening. Always keep the stitching line 1/4 inch from the raw edge of the strip. Notice that at the point, the raw edges of the sleeve and the strip are not even. Place a pin exactly at the point of the opening, then continue pinning the other side. In order to fit the sleeve to the binding, the slashed opening must spread apart to form a straight seam. With the sleeve side up, stitch the fabric strip to the slashed opening. Stitch just outside the reinforcement stitching line, still using a shortened stitch length of about 15 stitches per inch. Carefully stitch to the point of the placket. Stop, leaving the needle in the fabric, raise the presser foot, and adjust the sleeve fabric out of the way. Complete the stitching along the other side. Press the strip away from the sleeve, turning the seam toward the strip. Turn under a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the outer edge of the strip and press along the fold. Bring this folded edge to the seam line and press. An alternate method is to cut the strip along the selvage. If this was done, you would not have to fold under this seam allowance. Simply bring the selvage edge to the seam line and press. Pin along the folded edge and stitch in place by hand using either a blind or a slip stitch. Notice that the folded edge of the strip lies slightly above the stitching line, so that the hand stitching will not show on the right side. Slide the needle under the edge of the strip to hide the thread between each stitch. If you would like to finish the placket with top stitching instead of hand stitching, simply reverse the process by first attaching the strip to the wrong side of the garment. The final machine stitching will then appear on the right side of the fabric. To complete the placket, bring the two edges of the binding together and pin close to the end. Machine stitch diagonally across the folded end and stitch back and forth several times. This stitching prevents undue strain at the end of the placket and helps to keep the placket flat and smooth. None of the binding should be visible from the right side of the sleeve when it is completed. Making cuffs. Cuffs vary in size and shape. They may be cut in two pieces with a seam along the outer edge, or in one piece with the outer edge being a fold. Both types will be demonstrated. Determine the fold line by folding the cuff in half and pressing along the fold. Place the interfacing on the side of the cuff, which will form the upper cuff. One edge of the interfacing should be along the fold line. To hold the interfacing in place inside the cuff, catch stitch the interfacing along the fold line. Keep your hand stitching as inconspicuous as possible on the right side by taking very small stitches along the fold line. Be sure that the stitch taken through the interfacing does not go through to the fashion fabric. Machine stitch the interfacing to the upper cuff 1/2 inch from the raw edge on the other three sides. You may trim the interfacing close to the machine stitching at this time, or you may prefer to wait and layer the seam allowance after the final stitching has been completed. The cuff is now ready to be pinned to the sleeve. When making a two-piece cuff, the interfacing is placed to the wrong side of the piece which will form the upper cuff. Pin the interfacing to the fashion fabric. Machine stitch the interfacing 1/2 inch from the edge on all sides of the cuff. Hold the two layers securely so that the interfacing layer does not shift while machine stitching. Trim the interfacing close to the stitching, or you may prefer to wait and layer the seam allowance after the final stitching has been completed. With right sides together, pin the upper and under cuff pieces together along the unnotched edge, which is the outer edge of the cuff. Stitch along this seam, but do not stitch the ends of the cuff at this time. They will be stitched after the cuff has been attached to the garment. Notice that this stitching is about 1/8 inch deeper than the first stitching. Layer the seam allowance, then understitch along the seam, stitching the seam allowance to the under cuff. This understitching makes it easier when pressing and also helps to hold the cuff to the underside. Pin the sleeve to the upper cuff, matching notches and pattern markings. With the sleeve side up, stitch along the seam line. If the sleeve is gathered, this allows you to adjust the gathers as you stitch. On a gathered sleeve, place a second row of machine stitching into the seam allowance 1/4 inch from the seam line to flatten the gathered edge. Layer the seam allowance, cutting the sleeve seam allowance the narrowest. To prepare the cuff for stitching the ends, fold in half along the outer seam line with right sides together. On a two-piece cuff, be sure that the outer seam is folded towards the under cuff. When pinning the end seam, extend the under cuff about 1/8 inch to make the under cuff slightly narrower. Notice that the seam joining the sleeve to the cuff is folded up, and the seam on the under cuff is left extended. Stitch the end seams. The seam on the back cuff edge should be stitched 1/4 to 1/2 inch from the edge of the placket to create an underlap. The seam on the front cuff end should be even with the folded edge of the placket. Notice that this stitching is a little deeper than the original machine stitching. Trim the seam allowance diagonally at the corner, then press the seam open. This makes it easier to press the end seams once the cuff has been turned. Layer the seam allowances, cutting the undercuff seam the narrowest. The upper cuff seam may be left as is or trimmed a little narrower. Turn the cuff right side out, carefully pushing out the corners. When pressing the end seams, roll the seam slightly to the undercuff side, so that the undercuff will not show from the right side on the completed cuff. Turn under the seam allowance along the lower edge of the cuff. The fold should lie just above the stitching line, so the hand stitching will not show on the outside of the garment. Finish the inside edge by using a blind or a slip stitch. The finished cuff should be even in width, and no undercuff should show from the outside of the completed cuff. Attaching a cuff to a sleeve having a continuous lapped placket. A sleeve with a continuous lapped placket requires special folding of the placket when attaching a cuff. With right sides together, pin the lower edge of the sleeve to the cuff, matching notches and other pattern markings. The back placket edge, or the one closest to the sleeve underarm seam, should be left extended to provide for an underlap. place the edge of the placket about 1 inch from the end of the cuff. This provides for a 5/8 inch seam allowance plus an extension on the back cuff for the underlap. The front placket lap should be turned to the inside of the sleeve, and the folded edge should be placed just 5/8 inch from the end of the cuff. On the finished cuff, the front edge of the cuff will be even with the folded edge of the placket. Gather up the fullness in the sleeve and distribute the fullness evenly. With the sleeve side up, stitch the sleeve to the cuff as it is pinned. If the sleeve is gathered, this allows you to adjust the gathers as you stitch. On a gathered sleeve, place a second row of machine stitching into the seam allowance 1/4 inch from the seam line to flatten the gathered edge. Layer the seam allowance, cutting the sleeve seam allowance the narrowest. The cuff seam allowance may be left as is or trimmed a little narrower. To prepare the cuff for stitching the ends, fold in half along the outer seam line with right sides together. Extend the undercuff about 1/8 inch to make the undercuff slightly narrower. Notice that the seam joining the sleeve to the cuff is folded up, and the seam on the undercuff is left extended. Stitch the end seams. The finished end of the cuff and the front of the sleeve will be even with the folded edge of the placket. The back end of the cuff will extend beyond the edge of the placket, forming an underlap. Notice that the stitching line for the back cuff is about 3/8 inch from the edge of the placket. Trim the seam allowance diagonally at the corner. Then press the seam open. This makes it easier to press the cuff once it has been turned. Layer the seam allowance, cutting the undercuff seam allowance the narrowest. The upper cuff seam allowance may be left as is or trimmed a little narrower. Then turn the cuff right side out, carefully pushing out the corners. When pressing the end seams, roll the seam slightly to the undercuff side, so the undercuff will not show from the right side. Turn under the seam allowance along the lower edge of the undercuff. The fold should lie just above the stitching line, so the hand stitching will not show on the outside of the garment. Finish the inside edge by using a blind or a slip stitch. Top stitching could be added for a more sporty look. The finished cuff should be even in width, and no undercuff should show from the outside. The continuous lap placket should not show when the cuff is closed. Making a faced opening for a pleated sleeve closure. If there are no pattern markings for the faced placket, place 2 points 1 inch apart on the seam line of the lower edge of the sleeve, directly below the elbow area. Cut the facing piece about 2 1/2 inches by 1 1/2 inches and place on the right side of the sleeve, centering it over the placket markings. Stitch the facing piece to the sleeve, beginning at the lower edge of the sleeve. Stitch on a diagonal line to the first marking. Stop with the needle in the fabric and pivot the material. Stitch along the seam line to the second mark, then stitch out to the sleeve edge. Trim the seam allowance to within 1/4 inch of the stitching line. Then clip to the corners. These clips must go all the way to the stitching line. Then turn the facing to the wrong side, working the seam out to the edge and press. Turn under the seam allowance along the outer 3 sides of the facing and press again. To complete the faced opening, hand stitch the edges of the facing to the sleeve using a blind or a slip stitch. Pin the sleeve to the right side of the upper cuff. A 5/8 inch seam allowance on the end of the cuff should extend beyond the inside corners of the faced opening on the sleeve. The ends of the cuff are stitched after the sleeve has been attached to the cuff. Gather up the fullness on the sleeve and distribute the fullness evenly. Stitch the cuff to the sleeve as it is pinned. This stitching should be in line with the finished corners of the faced opening on the sleeve. On a gathered sleeve, place a second row of machine stitching into the seam allowance, 1/4 inch from the seam line to flatten the gathered edge. Notice that 5/8 inch of the cuff extends beyond the corner of the faced opening. To prepare the cuff for stitching the ends, fold in half along the outer seam line with right sides together. Extend the undercuff about 1/8 inch to make the undercuff narrower. Notice that the seam joining the sleeve to the cuff is folded up, and the seam on the undercuff is left extended. Stitch the ends of the cuff. The finished cuff ends should line up with the finished corners of the faced opening. Complete the cuff as described in the tape on making cuffs. The finished cuff should be even in width, and no undercuff should show from the outside. Notice that the faced opening on the sleeve forms a pleat when the cuff is closed. Setting in a shirt sleeve. The open or flat construction technique is usually followed when using the shirt sleeve method for setting in a sleeve. The type of sleeve used in this method has a less rounded sleeve cap seam line and is not eased as much as the regular set-in sleeve. The sleeve is stitched to the garment before stitching the underarm seams. Place a row of ease stitching between the notches along the seam line of the sleeve cap. Use a slightly lengthened stitch of about 10 stitches per inch. If the amount of ease allowed on the sleeve pattern is very small, this ease stitch may be omitted. Draw up the ease just slightly, but not as much as on a regular set-in sleeve. There should be no evidence of any puckering along the seam line. With right sides together, pin the sleeve cap to the garment armhole, matching shortings, notches, and underarm seam lines. Pin with the sleeve side up. Distribute the ease evenly along the sleeve cap seam line. Be sure that the sleeve has not been eased tighter than the length of the armhole seam on the garment. If it is desirable to fit the sleeve before stitching the seam, place pins parallel to and directly on the seam line. The side seams would also have to be pinned together before fitting the garment. A double-stitched seam is usually used along the sleeve seam line, as the seam allowance must be trimmed to about 1/4 inch. The first row of stitching is placed directly on the seam line. Stitch with the sleeve facing up. Remove the ease stitching. Then place a second row of either straight or zigzag machine stitching into the seam allowance 1/4 inch from the first stitching. The zigzag stitch would serve as the seam finish. A flat fell seam could also be used for a more tailored appearance. Trim the seam allowance close to the second row of stitching. The narrower seam allowance is necessary since the armhole seam is curved and it must be folded over under the arm when stitching the side seams. With right sides together, pin the underarm seam of the sleeve and the side seam of the shirt, matching the armhole seams and notches. The armhole seam allowances are usually turned towards the sleeve. Notice that on a short sleeve the seam may be shaped so that when the sleeve hem is folded back, it will be the same circumference as the sleeve. Complete the side seam with the same type of seam that was used for the armhole. If a flat fell seam is used, it is usually turned toward the back section of the shirt. This side seam was finished with a second row of zigzag stitching, placed 1/4 inch from the first stitching. Short sleeves may be completed with a hem or a cuff. If the shirt has long sleeves, finish the sleeve by attaching cuffs to the lower edge.